Inside a quiet, fluorescent-lit conference room, finance ministers, central bankers, and senior officials stared at encrypted screens. Coffee cups sat untouched. Phones vibrated but went unanswered. Outside, Europe slept. Inside, history shifted. With a few coordinated keystrokes, the United States and the European Union made a decision that had never before been taken against a G20 economy at this scale. Russia, one of the world's largest commodity exporters, a nuclear power, and a cornerstone of the global financial system, was cut off from SWIFT. At the same time, nearly $300 billion of its foreign exchange reserves were frozen overnight. It was described as a financial nuclear option. No tanks crossed borders. No missiles were launched. Yet in that moment, money itself became a weapon. Markets expected collapse. Headlines predicted chaos. Analysts spoke confidently. Russia would run out of dollars, imports would halt, inflation would spiral, and the state would buckle under financial isolation. This was how modern power worked now, not through armies, but through systems. And for decades, the most powerful system of all had been the dollar. But beneath the confidence of that night lay a paradox, one rarely discussed, and even less understood. The very act of using financial dominance as a weapon carried a hidden cost. A cost that history had recorded before. A cost that did not appear immediately, but unfolded slowly, silently, and irreversibly. To understand why, we must step back. Not years, but generations. Because February 26, 2022, was not the beginning of this story. It was the echo of a much older one. For over a century, global power has rested not just on military strength or industrial output, but on control of payment systems. The invisible rails that allow trade, debt, and trust to move across borders. Whoever controls those rails does not merely facilitate commerce. They define the rules of the world economy. In the early 20th century, that power belonged to Britain. London cleared global trade. Sterling financed empires. British banks decided who could pay and who could not. In 1914, during the opening days of World War I, Britain froze German assets and blocked access to its financial system. It worked temporarily. Germany struggled. Britain appeared unassailable. But something irreversible had begun. By 1944, the pound had lost its reserve status. The system Britain weaponized slowly slipped from its control. Not through invasion, not through revolution, but through erosion of trust. The United States inherited that role after World War II. Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, SWIFT, the petrodollar. Layer by layer, Washington built the most powerful financial architecture in human history. And for decades, it worked because it was predictable, neutral, stable, until it wasn't. When the U.S. sanctioned Iran, Venezuela, and smaller economies, the system absorbed the shock. Alternatives were discussed, but not built. The cost of defiance was too high. Russia changed that calculation. As the opening weeks of sanctions passed, something unexpected happened. The Russian state adapted. Capital controls were imposed. Energy exports continued. Trade routes shifted east and south. Payments moved to local currencies. New clearing systems, once dismissed as symbolic, suddenly mattered. And across the world, policymakers watched closely. Not because they supported Russia, but because they saw themselves. They saw what happened when reserves, once considered untouchable, were frozen by political decision. They saw that participation in the dollar system was not ownership, but permission. And permission could be revoked. This is the hidden tension at the heart of financial power. The stronger the weapon, the greater the incentive to escape it. Tonight's story is not about Russia alone. It is about a pattern that has repeated itself 4 times in the last 110 years. A pattern with 5 stages. And once stage 2 is reached, history shows there is no return. The question is not whether the dollar will disappear. The question is whether dominance can survive weaponization, and whether February 26, 2022, will be remembered as the moment the erosion became irreversible. SWIFT was never meant to be a weapon. Founded in 1973, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication was designed as a neutral messaging system, an efficient way for banks to communicate payment instructions across borders. It did not move money. It moved trust. But neutrality is fragile, because while SWIFT is technically headquartered in Belgium, it operates within a legal and political ecosystem dominated by the United States and its allies. Over time, access to SWIFT became synonymous with access to global trade. To be disconnected was to be isolated. This structure rested on a deeper foundation: the dollar's role as the world's primary reserve currency. Oil was priced in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. Reserves were held in dollars. And SWIFT was the nervous system that made it all work. By the early 2000s, over 70% of global reserves were held in dollars. This gave the U.S. an extraordinary privilege: the ability to finance deficits cheaply, export inflation, and enforce sanctions without deploying troops. But privilege carries risk. Part 2. Weaponization AS policy. The first major warning came quietly. After September 11th, the U.S. expanded financial surveillance and sanctions to combat terrorism. Banks complied. Systems tightened. The precedent was set. Later came Iran. Then Venezuela. Smaller economies were cut off from dollar clearing, forced into barter, shadow banking, or collapse. Each time, the lesson was the same: defy the system, and the system will punish you. But Russia was different. It was too large to ignore, too interconnected to isolate completely, and too strategic to be dismissed as an outlier. When SWIFT sanctions were imposed in 2022, Russia lost access to Western capital, but not to trade. Energy exports continued. China, India, and others stepped in. Payment systems like CIPS expanded rapidly. And most critically, reserves once thought sacrosanct were frozen. That changed everything. Part 3. The reserve shock. Central banks hold reserves for one reason: security. They are meant to be liquid, reliable, and politically neutral. When $300 billion in Russian reserves were immobilized, that assumption shattered. Suddenly, reserves were conditional. Countries began asking new questions. Are reserves truly ours? What happens if political alignment changes? Is diversification a necessity, not a hedge? The answers came quickly. Dollar reserve share declined steadily. Gold purchases surged to levels unseen since the 1970s. Bilateral trade agreements bypassed the dollar. Regional payment systems multiplied. None of this replaced the dollar overnight. But replacement was never the point. Resilience was. Part 4. The 5-stage pattern. History shows a repeating cycle. Stage 1. A dominant power controls global finance. Stage 2. It weaponizes access. Stage 3. Targets build alternatives. Stage 4. Neutrals hedge. Stage 5. The weapon loses credibility. Britain followed this path. So did previous empires. The United States entered Stage 2 decisively in 2022. And once Stage 3 begins, momentum shifts quietly, but permanently. Part 5. A multipolar reality. China's CIPS expanded rapidly. Trade in local currencies increased. Saudi Arabia priced oil in yuan. BRICS explored settlement mechanisms. These were not ideological moves. They were risk management. No single system failed. Trust did. And trust, once broken, does not return easily. History does not usually end with a single event. It ends with a realization. Long after the headlines fade, after markets stabilize and experts move on to the next crisis, the true consequences reveal themselves, not in chaos, but in quiet adjustment. That is how financial empires decline. Not with collapse, with choice. The story of SWIFT, sanctions, and the dollar is not a story of immediate failure. It is a story of incentives changing, of trust recalculated, of nations doing what nations have always done when survival is at stake: reducing dependence. When the United States and its allies froze Russian reserves in 2022, they demonstrated unprecedented financial power. But they also crossed an invisible line. For the first time, The world saw clearly that reserves held in dollars were not merely financial assets, they were political assets, subject to approval. That understanding did not remain confined to Moscow. It spread quietly through central banks in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, through finance ministries in countries that had never been sanctioned, but now understood that immunity was conditional. The lesson was simple and deeply unsettling. Participation in the dollar system is not ownership. It is access. And access can be revoked. From that moment forward, the global system began to change, not dramatically, not emotionally, but methodically. Gold purchases increased, not as protest, but as insurance. Trade agreements shifted toward local currencies, not out of ideology, but prudence. Alternative payment systems expanded, not to replace SWIFT overnight, but to ensure there was a fallback. No single decision was revolutionary. Together, they were irreversible. This is how reserve currencies lose dominance, not because they fail, but because they are no longer singular. The British pound did not vanish after World War II. It remained in use, respected and stable. But it was no longer the axis around which global finance revolved. The same pattern now confronts the dollar. A currency can be strong and still lose supremacy. It can be liquid and still be avoided. It can dominate markets and still inspire hedging. Dollar hegemony was built on trust, on the belief that the system was neutral, rules-based, and predictable. Weaponization altered that perception. And once neutrality is questioned, diversification becomes inevitable. This does not mean America is collapsing. It does not mean China has won. It does not mean the global economy will fracture overnight. What it means is subtler and more profound. It means the era of uncontested financial dominance is ending. A multipolar world does not announce itself with fanfare. It emerges as redundancy replaces reliance, as systems coexist instead of converge, as power diffuses rather than concentrates. In such a world, the dollar still matters, but it must compete. Sanctions still exist, but they cost more to deploy. Financial pressure still works, but it accelerates alternatives. And that is the paradox at the heart of modern power. The more frequently a system is weaponized, the faster others learn to live without it. Russia did not defeat the dollar. It exposed a vulnerability. By surviving outside the system, however imperfectly, it demonstrated that exclusion was no longer fatal. That proof changed calculations everywhere, from oil contracts settled in new currencies, to regional banks bypassing traditional rails, to central banks quietly rebalancing reserves. The shift is already underway, not driven by alliances, not driven by ideology, driven by risk. History shows that once this stage is reached, there is no reversal, only adaptation. The dollar will not disappear. It will remain central to trade, finance, and investment for decades. But dominance is not binary. It fades in degrees. And with each alternative built, each hedge placed, each bilateral settlement signed, the cost of using financial power rises. America's greatest strength, its ability to shape global finance, has also become its greatest constraint, because using that power now reshapes the system itself. This is not a story of villains or heroes. It is a story of systems behaving as systems always do. When trust erodes, redundancy grows. When power concentrates, resistance forms. When weapons are revealed, shields are built. The erosion of dollar dominance did not begin with SWIFT, but SWIFT made it visible. February 26, 2022, will not be remembered as the day the dollar fell. It will be remembered as the day the world stopped assuming it couldn't. And that assumption, once broken, can never be restored. Because financial hegemony does not end in defeat. It ends in preparation. Quietly, rationally, forever.